Question 1. Quality control measures reveal that a critical research deliverable, due in 2 weeks, is significantly delayed due to an unexpected equipment malfunction. The research team has identified a potential workaround, but it will require additional resources and may slightly impact the quality of a secondary data set. The sponsor has a strict policy against any deviation from the original scope and timeline without prior written approval. How should the research professional best address this situation to uphold contractual obligations and maintain a positive sponsor relationship? Option A. Proceed with the workaround, hoping the sponsor will not notice the minor impact on the secondary data set and address any questions after the deliverable has been submitted. Option B. Immediately inform the sponsor of the equipment malfunction, explain the proposed workaround and its implications, and request a meeting to discuss potential adjustments to the timeline or scope, emphasizing a commitment to finding a mutually agreeable solution. Option C. Submit a deliverable that meets the original deadline but compromises the quality of the primary research findings to avoid further complications with the sponsor's strict policies. Option D. Inform the sponsor only after the deadline has passed and the deliverable cannot be submitted on time, explaining the equipment malfunction as the sole reason for the delay. Correct answer is B. Immediately inform the sponsor of the equipment malfunction, explain the proposed workaround and its implications, and request a meeting to discuss potential adjustments to the timeline or scope, emphasizing a commitment to finding a mutually agreeable solution. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in research contract negotiations where a critical deliverable deadline is jeopardized by an unforeseen technical issue. The professional's role is to navigate this conflict while upholding contractual obligations, maintaining the sponsor relationship, and ensuring the integrity of the research. The challenge lies in balancing the need for timely delivery with the reality of unexpected problems, requiring a decision-making process that is both pragmatic and ethically sound, adhering strictly to the CRCP framework. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves transparent communication with the sponsor, a collaborative problem-solving effort to identify alternative solutions or revise timelines, and a clear articulation of the impact on the contract. This aligns with CRCP principles of good faith negotiation, proactive risk management, and maintaining clear lines of communication. It demonstrates a commitment to fulfilling contractual intent even when faced with unforeseen obstacles, fostering trust and a stronger working relationship. This approach prioritizes finding a mutually agreeable path forward, which is essential for the long-term success of research collaborations governed by contractual agreements. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves withholding information from the sponsor until the deadline is missed. This constitutes a failure of transparency and good faith, potentially violating contractual clauses related to reporting and communication. It erodes trust and can lead to significant reputational damage and contractual disputes. Another incorrect approach is to unilaterally extend the deadline without sponsor agreement. This bypasses the negotiation process and disregards the sponsor's vested interest in the project timeline. It is a breach of contractual terms and demonstrates a lack of respect for the collaborative nature of research agreements. A third incorrect approach is to offer a substandard deliverable to meet the original deadline. This compromises the scientific integrity of the research and the quality of the work, which is a fundamental breach of the research contract's purpose. It also risks invalidating the research findings and damaging the reputation of all parties involved. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework when faced with such conflicts. This framework typically involves 1. Assessing the situation. Clearly understand the nature of the problem, its impact, and the contractual implications. 2. Identifying stakeholders. Recognize who needs to be informed and involved, sponsor, internal team, etc. 3. Exploring options. Brainstorm potential solutions, considering feasibility, cost, and impact on the contract. 4. Communicating proactively. Engage with the sponsor early and transparently to discuss the issue and potential solutions. 5. Negotiating collaboratively. Work with the sponsor to find a mutually acceptable resolution, which may involve contract amendments. 6. Documenting all decisions. Ensure all agreements and changes are formally recorded. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are well considered, ethically sound, and contractually compliant. Question 2. Governance review demonstrates that a research institution has secured funding from a commercial sponsor for a novel drug development project. The sponsor, eager to expedite market entry, is requesting immediate and unrestricted access to all raw research data generated throughout the project, including preliminary findings and proprietary methodologies. The research institution, however, is concerned about protecting its intellectual property, ensuring proper attribution for future publications, and maintaining control over the dissemination of sensitive information that could impact its long-term research competitiveness and future funding opportunities. What negotiation strategy best balances the sponsor's immediate data needs with the institution's long-term research and intellectual property protection requirements, in accordance with CRCP guidelines? Option A. Refuse to share any raw data until the project is fully completed and all intellectual property has been patented, citing the need for absolute protection of institutional assets. Option B. Propose a phased data release schedule, granting the sponsor access to aggregated and anonymized data at key project milestones, alongside opportunities for joint authorship on publications, while retaining control over raw, unanalyzed data until project completion or specific contractual triggers are met. Option C. Immediately grant the sponsor unrestricted access to all raw research data as requested to ensure a smooth and cooperative relationship, prioritizing the sponsor's immediate satisfaction. Option D. Agree to share all raw data but insist on sole authorship for all publications and prohibit any external dissemination of findings by the sponsor. The correct answer is B. Propose a phased data release schedule, granting the sponsor access to aggregated and anonymized data at key project milestones, alongside opportunities for joint authorship on publications, while retaining control over raw, unanalyzed data until project completion or specific contractual triggers are met. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating conflicting stakeholder interests within the strict confines of the Certified Research Contracts Professional (CRCP) regulatory framework. The research sponsor's desire for immediate, broad data access clashes with the research institution's need to protect intellectual property and ensure the long-term viability of future research funding, all while adhering to CRCP guidelines on data sharing and publication. Balancing these competing demands requires a nuanced understanding of negotiation principles and their application within a regulated environment. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes a collaborative negotiation strategy focused on finding mutually beneficial terms. This involves understanding the underlying interests of both the sponsor and the institution, rather than just their stated positions. By proposing a phased data release tied to specific milestones and offering opportunities for joint publications, the institution demonstrates a commitment to fulfilling the sponsor's need for information, while safeguarding its own interests and adhering to CRCP principles of responsible data management and intellectual property protection. This approach fosters a positive long-term relationship and aligns with ethical research practices by ensuring proper attribution and control over research outputs. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves rigidly adhering to the initial proposal without seeking compromise. This fails to acknowledge the sponsor's legitimate interest in the research outcomes and can lead to an impasse, potentially jeopardizing future collaborations. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of good faith negotiation. From a regulatory perspective, while not a direct violation, it could be seen as failing to act in the best interest of advancing research, a core tenet implicitly supported by CRCP guidelines. Another incorrect approach is to concede all data access immediately without any conditions. This directly contravenes CRCP guidelines concerning the protection of intellectual property and the responsible dissemination of research findings. It exposes the institution to significant risks, including loss of competitive advantage and potential financial detriment, and could be viewed as a breach of fiduciary duty to the institution. A third incorrect approach is to delay negotiations indefinitely or refuse to engage with the sponsor's concerns. This is unprofessional and unethical, as it undermines the collaborative spirit of research partnerships. It also risks violating implicit CRCP expectations of timely and transparent communication in contractual matters, potentially leading to disputes and reputational damage. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such negotiations by first identifying the core interests of all parties involved. This requires active listening and a willingness to explore various solutions. The CRCP framework provides the boundaries within which these solutions must operate, emphasizing fairness, transparency, and the protection of intellectual property. A structured negotiation process, starting with understanding needs, exploring options, and then reaching an agreement that satisfies as many interests as possible within the regulatory framework, is crucial. Professionals should always aim for win-win outcomes that foster trust and long-term partnerships, while remaining vigilant about compliance with all applicable regulations and ethical standards. Question 3. The evaluation methodology shows a discrepancy between the principal investigator's interpretation of the research project's scope of work and the sponsor's expectations regarding specific deliverables and milestones. The PI believes their broad research direction fulfills the contract, while the sponsor emphasizes the need for clearly defined, measurable outputs at specific stages. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of effective research contract management and CRCP best practices? Option A. Focus on the overarching research objective, assuming that any progress made in the general field of study, as interpreted by the PI, satisfies the sponsor's investment. Option B. Rely on the PI's subjective assessment of their research's contribution to the field, without requiring strict adherence to the contractually defined deliverables and milestones. Option C. Interpret the scope of work broadly to encompass any research activities the PI deems beneficial, even if they deviate significantly from the explicitly stated deliverables and milestones. Option D. Prioritize a detailed review of the contractual definitions of scope of work, deliverables, and milestones, ensuring the PI's research activities directly address these explicit contractual terms, and that progress is objectively verifiable against agreed-upon stages. The correct answer is D. Prioritize a detailed review of the contractual definitions of scope of work, deliverables, and milestones, ensuring the PI's research activities directly address these explicit contractual terms, and that progress is objectively verifiable against agreed-upon stages. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in research contracting where the initial understanding of the scope of work, becomes misaligned with the actual research activities undertaken. The principal investigator's PI interpretation of the SOW, focusing on the overarching research goal, contrasts with the sponsor's expectation of detailed, measurable steps and defined outputs. This divergence can lead to disputes over progress, deliverables, and ultimately payment. The professional challenge lies in navigating this ambiguity while adhering to contractual obligations and maintaining a productive research relationship, all within the framework of the Certified Research Contracts Professional (CRCP) exam-specified regulatory environment. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes a proactive and detailed review of the SOW, deliverables, and milestones as defined in the contract. This involves ensuring that the PI's understanding aligns with the explicit contractual language and that the research plan directly addresses the agreed-upon objectives and outputs. For a CRCP professional, this means scrutinizing the SOW for clarity, specificity, and measurability, verifying that deliverables are clearly defined and verifiable, and confirming that milestones are objective and tied to tangible progress. This approach upholds the contractual integrity, minimizes the risk of disputes, and ensures that both parties are working towards the same, clearly articulated goals, which is a cornerstone of responsible contract management under relevant research funding regulations. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on the PI's perceived intent without rigorous contractual verification. This fails to acknowledge the legally binding nature of the SOW and the sponsor's right to expect adherence to the written terms. Ethically and regulatorily, this can lead to accusations of misrepresentation or failure to perform as contracted, potentially jeopardizing future funding and damaging institutional reputation. Another incorrect approach prioritizes the overarching research goal above the specific contractual terms for deliverables and milestones. While the research objective is important, the contract dictates the pathway and the measurable achievements. Ignoring these specific contractual elements can result in the sponsor not receiving what they paid for, leading to breach of contract claims and potential financial penalties. This demonstrates a failure to uphold the contractual obligations and a lack of due diligence in contract administration. A third incorrect approach involves assuming that any research activity contributing to the general field of study fulfills the SOW, regardless of its explicit inclusion or alignment with defined deliverables. This approach disregards the principle of meeting the bargain inherent in any contract. It can lead to the sponsor funding research that does not meet their specific objectives or reporting requirements, creating a significant ethical and regulatory breach by not delivering the contracted for value. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach to contract review and management. This involves 1. Thoroughly understanding the contractual definitions of scope of work, deliverables, and milestones. 2. Engaging in open communication with the principal investigator to ensure their understanding aligns with the contract. 3. Regularly monitoring research progress against defined milestones and deliverables. 4. Documenting all communications and deviations from the SOW. 5. Proactively addressing any potential misalignments or ambiguities with the sponsor before they escalate into disputes. This structured process ensures compliance, mitigates risk, and fosters trust between research institutions and sponsors. Question 4. Cost-benefit analysis shows that while a contract offers the most stringent oversight and clear deliverables, a grant provides maximum flexibility for exploratory research. A cooperative agreement falls in between, requiring substantial government involvement in the research. Given these characteristics, which approach best aligns with a scenario where the funding agency's primary goal is to advance scientific knowledge in a particular field, allowing the recipient significant autonomy in methodology, but expecting regular progress reports and the potential for joint dissemination of findings. Option A. A contract, as it provides the clearest definition of deliverables and oversight, ensuring the agency's investment is directly tied to measurable scientific advancements. Option B. Cooperative agreement, as it balances the need for government oversight and collaboration with recipient autonomy, aligning with the agency's goal of advancing knowledge while ensuring shared progress and dissemination. Option C. A grant, as the agency's primary goal is knowledge advancement, and the recipient's autonomy is paramount, with progress reports and dissemination being secondary considerations that can be accommodated within grant terms. Option D. A grant, as it offers the most flexibility for exploratory research, which is the primary goal of advancing scientific knowledge, and the agency's expectation of progress reports and dissemination can be managed through standard reporting requirements. The correct answer is B. A cooperative agreement, as it balances the need for government oversight and collaboration with recipient autonomy, aligning with the agency's goal of advancing knowledge while ensuring shared progress and dissemination. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because selecting the appropriate research instrument, grant, cooperative agreement, or contract requires a nuanced understanding of the underlying intent of the funding and the nature of the relationship between the parties. Mischaracterizing the relationship can lead to significant compliance issues, audit findings, and potential disputes. The CRCP professional must carefully evaluate the balance of control, the primary purpose of the funding, and the expected deliverables to ensure alignment with the chosen instrument's regulatory framework. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes accurate classification based on the substance of the transaction, not just its superficial appearance. This ensures compliance with the specific regulations governing each instrument type, such as those found in the Federal Acquisition Regulation, FAR for contracts, or the Office of Management and Budget guidance for grants and cooperative agreements. By correctly identifying the primary purpose and the level of government involvement, the CRCP professional safeguards the organization from potential penalties, ensures proper financial stewardship, and maintains the integrity of the research funding process. An incorrect approach that misclassifies a grant as a contract, for instance, would fail to adhere to the principles of grant administration, which typically involve less stringent oversight and a focus on supporting research objectives rather than acquiring specific goods or services. This could lead to an over-application of contractual requirements, hindering the research progress and potentially violating grant terms. Conversely, classifying a true contract as a grant would circumvent the competitive procurement processes and oversight mechanisms designed to ensure value for money and accountability in government acquisitions, representing a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Similarly, misclassifying a cooperative agreement as a grant or contract would ignore the shared understanding and collaboration inherent in cooperative agreements, leading to inappropriate management and reporting. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the funding agency's stated objectives and the proposed activities. They should then analyze the degree of government involvement, the nature of the expected outcomes e.g., specific deliverables versus general research advancement, and the level of discretion afforded to the recipient. This analysis should be mapped against the defining characteristics of grants, cooperative agreements, and contracts as defined by applicable U.S. federal regulations. When in doubt, consulting with legal counsel or subject matter experts specializing in federal grants and contracts is a crucial step in ensuring correct classification and compliance. Question 5. Assessment of a contract for the development of a novel software algorithm designated as a commercial item under FAR Part 12 for the Department of Defense. The contracting officer has indicated that only FAR Part 12 clauses are applicable. However, the software involves sensitive defense-related research data. Which of the following actions best ensures compliance with federal regulations and protects the government's interests? Option A. Request clarification from the contracting officer regarding the applicability of relevant DFARS clauses, particularly those pertaining to data rights and intellectual property for defense-related research, given the sensitive nature of the data involved. Option B. Advise the contracting officer that DFARS clauses are irrelevant because the item has been designated as commercial under FAR Part 12, and no further regulatory review is necessary. Option C. Proceed with contract awards solely based on FAR Part 12 clauses, as the contracting officer has determined it is a commercial item acquisition. Option D. Conduct an independent legal review of the contract to determine if any DFARS clauses are mandatory, without consulting the contracting officer. The correct answer is A. Request clarification from the contracting officer regarding the applicability of relevant DFARS clauses, particularly those pertaining to data rights and intellectual property for defense-related research, given the sensitive nature of the data involved. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in federal research contracting, navigating the interplay between different regulatory frameworks when a contract involves both commercial items and specialized government requirements. The professional challenge lies in accurately identifying which regulations apply and how they interact, particularly when the contracting officer's interpretation might be incomplete or misapplied. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance and protect the government's interests, while also upholding the contractor's rights and obligations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a thorough understanding of the hierarchy and applicability of federal acquisition regulations. Specifically, it recognizes that, while FAR Part 12 governs the acquisition of commercial items, DFARS clauses are mandatory when applicable to Department of Defense contracts, even for commercial items, unless specifically waived or exempted. This approach prioritizes compliance with the more specific and mandatory DFARS requirements, ensuring that the contract reflects the government's unique needs and protections for defense-related research. It also involves proactive communication with the contracting officer to clarify any ambiguities, which is a cornerstone of ethical and effective contract administration. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on FAR Part 12 without considering DFARS would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from an incomplete understanding of the regulatory landscape. DFARS clauses are often more stringent and tailored to defense needs than general FAR clauses. Ignoring them could lead to a contract that does not adequately protect the government's intellectual property, data rights, or security requirements, thereby creating significant risk. Ethically, it represents a failure to uphold the government's best interests by not ensuring all applicable protective measures are in place. Another incorrect approach that relies on the contracting officer's initial statement without further inquiry is also professionally deficient. While deference to the contracting officer is generally appropriate, it is not absolute when there is a clear indication of potential regulatory misapplication or omission. A professional contract specialist has a responsibility to identify and flag potential compliance issues, even if it requires further discussion. Failing to do so could result in a non-compliant contract, exposing both the government and the contractor to risks. This is an ethical failure to exercise due diligence and professional skepticism. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. 1. Identify the nature of the acquisition, e.g., commercial item, non-commercial item, service. 2. Determine the primary regulatory framework, e.g., FAR Part 12 for commercial items. 3. Ascertain if any agency-specific supplements like DFARS apply based on the agency, contract type, or subject matter. 4. Cross-reference mandatory clauses from supplements with the primary framework, paying attention to any specific applicability rules or exceptions. 5. If there is a conflict or ambiguity, or if a mandatory clause from a supplement appears to be overlooked, engage in professional dialogue with the contracting officer to seek clarification and ensure correct application. 6. Document all communications and decisions regarding regulatory interpretation and application. Question 6. Comparative studies suggest that research contract professionals often face pressure to expedite negotiations to secure funding. In a scenario where a sponsor insists on immediate ownership of all intellectual property generated from the research, even before the full scope of discoveries is known, and also demands the right to review and approve all publications before submission. What is the most appropriate course of action for a certified research contracts professional, CRCP, operating under U.S. federal regulations and institutional guidelines? Option A. Focus solely on negotiating the budget and payment schedule, assuming that intellectual property and publication clauses are standard and will be handled by other departments. Option B. Immediately reject the sponsor's terms and inform them that the institution cannot proceed with the contract under such conditions without attempting to find common ground. Option C. Propose alternative clauses that define intellectual property ownership based on inventorship and contribution, and establish a reasonable review period for publications that allows for scientific accuracy checks without unduly restricting dissemination. Option D. Accept the sponsor's terms without question to ensure the research funding is secured promptly, as the sponsor's financial commitment is the primary objective. The correct answer is C. Propose alternative clauses that define intellectual property ownership based on inventorship and contribution, and establish a reasonable review period for publications that allows for scientific accuracy checks without unduly restricting dissemination. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in research contract negotiation where a sponsor, driven by a desire for rapid commercialization, pushes for terms that could compromise the integrity of the research process and the institution's intellectual property rights. The principal investigator, PI, is caught between the sponsor's demands and the institution's ethical and legal obligations, requiring careful navigation to balance competing interests without jeopardizing the research or future collaborations. The challenge lies in identifying and articulating the risks associated with overly aggressive sponsor terms and proposing mutually beneficial alternatives that align with regulatory requirements and institutional policies. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the proposed contract terms against established institutional policies, relevant U.S. federal regulations, such as those governing research misconduct, intellectual property and data integrity, and ethical guidelines for research conduct. It requires the research contract professional to identify clauses that could lead to conflicts of interest, premature disclosure of findings, or undue influence on research outcomes. The professional should then engage in proactive negotiation, clearly explaining the rationale behind proposed modifications, focusing on preserving research independence, ensuring proper attribution of intellectual property, and maintaining compliance with all applicable laws and regulations. This approach upholds the principles of scientific integrity and fiduciary responsibility to the institution and the public. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediate capitulation to the sponsor's demands to secure the funding quickly. This fails to uphold the institution's responsibility to protect its researchers, its intellectual property, and the integrity of the research itself. It risks violating regulations related to conflicts of interest and could lead to the premature dissemination of unverified data, undermining scientific rigor, and potentially leading to reputational damage and legal liabilities. Another incorrect approach is to refuse to negotiate any terms that deviate from a standard template, without considering the specific context of the research and the sponsor's legitimate interests. While institutional policies are important, Rigid adherence without flexibility can stifle valuable research collaborations and may not adequately address unique aspects of the project. This can lead to missed opportunities for beneficial research and may be perceived as uncooperative, potentially damaging future relationships. A third incorrect approach is to focus solely on the financial aspects of the contract, neglecting the clauses related to intellectual property, publication rights, and data ownership. This oversight can lead to significant disputes later in the research lifecycle, potentially resulting in loss of intellectual property rights, restrictions on dissemination of findings, and breaches of regulatory requirements concerning data management and reporting. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach, prioritizing the protection of institutional integrity and research ethics. This involves a systematic review of all contract clauses, identifying potential areas of conflict or noncompliance. When faced with sponsor demands, the professional should seek to understand the sponsor's underlying objectives and explore alternative language that achieves those objectives while remaining compliant with regulations and institutional policies. Open and transparent communication with both the sponsor and internal stakeholders, e.g., legal counsel, research compliance officers, PI, is crucial. The decision-making process should be guided by a commitment to ethical conduct, regulatory adherence, and the long-term sustainability of research endeavors. Question 7. The risk matrix shows a high likelihood of novel discoveries arising from a sponsored research project. The contract with the external funding body contains a clause stating that all intellectual property developed during the course of this research shall be the property of the funding body. However, the institution's standard IP policy reserves ownership of IP to the institution unless otherwise agreed. What is the most appropriate initial step for the CRCP professional to take to manage the IP risk? Option A. Advise the institution to reject the contract due to the conflicting IP clauses. Option B. Proceed with the assumption that the funding body's clause supersedes the institutional IP policy without further investigation. Option C. Initiate a formal review of the research contract's IP clause in conjunction with the institution's IP policy and seek clarification from the funding body regarding the scope of developed during the course of this research. Option D. Immediately inform the researchers that all their discoveries will belong to the funding body as per the contract. The correct answer is C. Initiate a formal review of the research contract's IP clause in conjunction with the institution's IP policy and seek clarification from the funding body regarding the scope of developed during the course of this research. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of intellectual property, IP, ownership in research contracts, specifically when dealing with novel discoveries arising from collaborative efforts funded by external entities. The CRCP professional must balance the contractual obligations to the funding body with the potential IP rights of the researchers and the institution, all within the strict confines of the specified regulatory framework. Careful judgment is required to avoid contractual breaches, protect institutional assets, and maintain positive research relationships. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough review of the research contract's IP clauses and relevant governing regulations. This involves identifying pre-existing IP, defining ownership of newly created IP, and establishing clear licensing or assignment terms. Adherence to the contract stipulations and applicable laws ensures that all parties' rights are respected, minimizing legal and financial risks. This proactive and contractually compliant stance is essential for ethical research conduct and sound contract management. An incorrect approach that fails to clearly define IP ownership in the contract, leading to ambiguity, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This ambiguity can result in disputes, litigation, and damage to the institution's reputation. It violates the principle of good faith and fair dealing inherent in contractual relationships and may contravene specific clauses within the contract or governing regulations that mandate clear IP allocation. Another incorrect approach, such as assuming the funding body automatically owns all IP without explicit contractual provision, is also professionally unacceptable. This can lead to the forfeiture of valuable institutional IP, hindering future commercialization and research opportunities. It demonstrates a lack of diligence in understanding the contractual terms and the specific IP rights that may accrue to the institution or its researchers under the agreement and relevant laws. A further incorrect approach, such as unilaterally assigning IP rights to researchers without considering the funding body's contractual entitlements or institutional policies, is a direct breach of contract and potentially a violation of research ethics. This can lead to disputes with the funder and may not align with the institution's strategic IP management objectives. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of the research contract, identifying all clauses pertaining to IP. This should be followed by an assessment of the regulatory framework governing IP in research contracts within the specified jurisdiction. Consultation with legal counsel and institutional IP management offices is crucial to ensure all potential IP issues are addressed comprehensively and in compliance with contractual and legal obligations. A risk-based approach, identifying potential IP disputes early and implementing mitigation strategies, is paramount. Question 8. To address the challenge of negotiating a complex research contract where differing institutional priorities and risk tolerances are apparent, which communication strategy best ensures a mutually beneficial and compliant agreement? Option A. Focus on presenting your organization's strongest arguments and concessions only when absolutely necessary, aiming to secure the most favorable terms through assertive and persistent advocacy. Option B. Clearly articulate your organization's non-negotiable requirements and actively seek to understand the underlying concerns and objectives of the counterparty to identify areas for compromise and collaborative problem-solving. Option C. Prioritize speed in reaching an agreement by presenting a comprehensive proposal and encouraging the counterparty to accept it with minimal discussion to avoid protracted negotiations. Option D. Emphasize the long-term benefits of the partnership and use persuasive language to encourage the counterparty to align with your organization's proposed terms, downplaying any potential risks or complexities. The correct answer is B. Clearly articulate your organization's non-negotiable requirements and actively seek to understand the underlying concerns and objectives of the counterparty to identify areas for compromise and collaborative problem-solving. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because effective communication during negotiation is paramount to achieving favorable outcomes while adhering to ethical and regulatory standards. CRCP professional must balance the need to advocate for their organization's interests with the imperative to maintain transparency, avoid misrepresentation, and ensure all parties understand the terms and implications of the research contract. Miscommunication can lead to misunderstandings, disputes, and potentially breaches of contract or regulatory noncompliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes clarity, active listening, and a collaborative problem-solving mindset by clearly articulating the organization's needs and constraints, actively seeking to understand the counterparty's perspective, and proposing solutions that address mutual concerns. The CRCP professional fosters an environment of trust and mutual respect. This aligns with the ethical principles of honesty and fairness, and implicitly supports regulatory compliance by ensuring that all parties enter into the agreement with a shared understanding of its terms, thereby minimizing the risk of future disputes or misinterpretations that could lead to regulatory issues. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on aggressive assertion without seeking to understand the other party's position fails to acknowledge the collaborative nature of contract negotiation and can lead to an impasse or an agreement that is not sustainable. This can create an environment where one party feels exploited, increasing the likelihood of future disputes and potential regulatory scrutiny if the contract's terms are later challenged due to perceived unfairness or lack of genuine agreement. Another incorrect approach that involves withholding crucial information or making ambiguous statements, even if not outright falsehoods, undermines the principle of good faith negotiation. This can lead to a contract that is based on incomplete understanding, creating a significant risk of future legal challenges and regulatory noncompliance if the undisclosed information becomes relevant to the research's conduct or outcomes. Such tactics are ethically questionable and can be viewed as a failure to uphold professional integrity. A further incorrect approach that relies on emotional appeals or personal persuasion rather than objective reasoning and contractual substance is also professionally unsound. While building rapport is important, Decisions regarding research contracts must be grounded in factual analysis and mutual benefit. Over-reliance on emotional tactics can obscure critical contractual details and lead to agreements that are not strategically sound or compliant, potentially exposing the organization to unforeseen risks and regulatory pitfalls. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, thoroughly understand your organization's objectives and limitations. Second, actively listen to and seek to understand the counterparty's objectives and constraints. Third, communicate your organization's position clearly and concisely, using objective language. Fourth, identify areas of potential agreement and disagreement. Fifth, collaboratively explore solutions that address mutual interests, focusing on fairness and long-term viability. And finally, ensure all terms are clearly documented and understood by all parties. Question 9. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need to streamline the contract review process for federally funded research projects. When assessing the legal framework governing these contracts, which approach best mitigates compliance risks and ensures adherence to all applicable requirements? Option A. Rely solely on the institution's internal policies and procedures, as they are designed to manage institutional risk and operational efficiency. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive review of federal regulations, relevant state laws, and the institution's internal policies and procedures, cross-referencing them to identify any conflicts or areas requiring specific attention. Option C. Prioritize a review of federal regulations only, as they represent the highest level of authority for federally funded research. Option D. Focus primarily on the most recent revisions of the institution's internal policies, assuming they encompass all necessary federal and state compliance considerations. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive review of federal regulations, relevant state laws, and the institution's internal policies and procedures, cross-referencing them to identify any conflicts or areas requiring specific attention. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the complex interplay between federal funding requirements, state-specific regulations, and institutional policies, all of which govern research contracts. A CRCP professional must exercise careful judgment to ensure compliance across these multiple layers of authority. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive review of all applicable legal and policy frameworks. This ensures that the research contract is not only legally sound, but also aligns with the ethical obligations and operational guidelines of the institution and funding agencies. Specifically, understanding the hierarchy of these regulations is crucial. Federal regulations often set minimum standards, but state laws and institutional policies can impose stricter requirements. A thorough risk assessment, as outlined in the correct approach, allows for proactive identification and mitigation of potential compliance issues before they arise, safeguarding the institution and the research integrity. An incorrect approach that solely relies on federal regulations fails to acknowledge the potential for more stringent state laws or specific institutional policies that might apply. This could lead to a contract that is technically compliant with federal law but violates state statutes or institutional bylaws, exposing the institution to legal challenges, funding sanctions, or reputational damage. Another incorrect approach that focuses only on institutional policies overlooks the overarching federal and state legal mandates that govern research funding and conduct. While institutional policies are important, they cannot supersede or contradict higher-level legal requirements. Failure to consider these external legal frameworks can result in contracts that are unenforceable or lead to noncompliance with funding terms. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over thoroughness by only reviewing the most recent institutional policy revision is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. Research contracts are complex legal documents with far-reaching implications. A superficial review risks missing critical clauses related to intellectual property, data ownership, publication rights, or indemnification that are dictated by federal and state laws, or by older but still relevant institutional policies. This haste can lead to contractual disputes, intellectual property disputes, and potential breaches of funding agreements. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. 1. Identify all relevant regulatory bodies and their respective frameworks, federal, state. 2. Thoroughly review the institution's internal policies and procedures related to research contracting. 3. Conduct a risk assessment by cross-referencing all identified frameworks to pinpoint potential conflicts or areas of stricter compliance. 4. Engage legal counsel and relevant institutional compliance officers for clarification and guidance on complex or ambiguous issues. 5. Document the entire review process and the rationale for contractual decisions. Question 10. Market research demonstrates a significant opportunity to collaborate with a new external partner on a cutting-edge research project. The proposed contract outlines the project's objectives, deliverables, and a preliminary budget. However, before proceeding, what is the most critical step for a certified research contracts professional, CRCP, to undertake to ensure the organization's protection and the project's success? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment of the proposed contract, identifying potential legal, financial, operational, and ethical liabilities, and proposing mitigation strategies. Option B. Focus solely on negotiating the most favorable payment terms to maximize the organization's immediate financial return. Option C. Immediately finalize the contract to secure the research opportunity before competitors can engage with the partner. Option D. Prioritize the technical feasibility of the research objectives as outlined in the proposal, assuming all other contractual aspects are standard. Correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment of the proposed contract, identifying potential legal, financial, operational, and ethical liabilities, and proposing mitigation strategies. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a proactive and comprehensive assessment of potential risks inherent in a research contract before significant resources are committed. The CRCP professional must balance the desire to secure valuable research with the imperative to protect the organization from unforeseen liabilities and operational disruptions. Careful judgment is required to identify, evaluate, and propose mitigation strategies for these risks, ensuring the contract aligns with organizational objectives and regulatory compliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it systematically addresses potential risks through a structured assessment process. This aligns with the principles of good governance and responsible contract management, which are implicitly or explicitly supported by regulatory frameworks governing research and contractual agreements. By identifying risks early, the CRCP professional can inform decision-making, negotiate appropriate contractual clauses, e.g., indemnification, intellectual property rights, data security, termination, and ensure adequate contingency planning. This proactive stance minimizes the likelihood of costly disputes, project delays, or reputational damage, thereby safeguarding the organization's interests and ensuring the successful execution of the research. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the immediate benefits of the research without a thorough risk assessment fails to uphold professional standards. This oversight can lead to significant regulatory and ethical failures. For instance, neglecting to assess data privacy risks could result in breaches of data protection laws e.g., GDPR if applicable, or equivalent U.S. privacy regulations like HIPAA for health research, leading to substantial fines and loss of trust. Similarly, failing to clarify intellectual property ownership could result in disputes that hinder future commercialization or publication, violating principles of fair attribution and potentially breaching grant funding terms. Ignoring potential conflicts of interest or ethical considerations in the research methodology could lead to non-compliance with Institutional Review Board (IRB) or Ethics Committee requirements, jeopardizing the research's integrity and the organization's reputation. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic risk identification and assessment framework. This includes understanding the research scope, identifying all parties involved, evaluating potential legal, financial, operational, and ethical risks, and then developing strategies to mitigate or transfer these risks. This process should be iterative, with reassessments conducted as the contract progresses and new information emerges. Collaboration with legal counsel, finance departments, and relevant subject matter experts is crucial to ensure a holistic and robust risk management strategy. Question 11. Investigation of process optimization strategies for research institutions, contract lifecycle management, specifically focusing on reducing the time from contract initiation to execution for sponsored research agreements, while ensuring adherence to all applicable U.S. federal regulations and institutional policies. Which of the following approaches best balances efficiency gains with regulatory compliance and risk mitigation? Option A. Implementing a digital contract management system with automated workflow routing, standardized templates for common contract clauses, and integrated compliance checklists to streamline review and approval processes. Option B. Directing legal and compliance teams to prioritize all research contract reviews above other departmental tasks, regardless of the complexity or urgency of other matters. Option C. Relying on ad hoc communication and manual tracking of contract progress to identify and address bottlenecks as they arise, without formal process documentation. Option D. Reducing the number of internal review stages for all research contracts to accelerate the approval timeline, with a focus on speed over comprehensive due diligence. The correct answer is A. Implementing a digital contract management system with automated workflow routing, standardized templates for common contract clauses, and integrated compliance checklists to streamline review and approval processes. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in contract lifecycle management, ensuring efficient and compliant contract execution while navigating potential delays and resource constraints. The professional challenge lies in balancing the need for speed with the imperative to adhere to established regulatory frameworks and internal policies, particularly concerning research contracts which often involve sensitive data, intellectual property, and stringent compliance requirements. Careful judgment is required to identify and implement process optimizations that enhance efficiency without compromising legal, ethical, or contractual obligations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it focuses on proactive identification and mitigation of bottlenecks within the contract initiation and execution phases. By leveraging technology for workflow automation and establishing clear communication protocols, it directly addresses common sources of delay and error. This aligns with regulatory expectations for due diligence, proper record keeping, and timely contract finalization, which are crucial for maintaining research integrity and avoiding potential disputes or compliance breaches. This approach fosters a culture of continuous improvement, essential for adapting to evolving regulatory landscapes and operational demands. An incorrect approach that relies solely on expediting review without addressing underlying process inefficiencies is professionally unacceptable. This could lead to rushed decisions, overlooking critical clauses, or failing to secure necessary internal approvals, thereby increasing the risk of non-compliance with research ethics guidelines or contractual terms. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over thoroughness in due diligence, such as skipping essential risk assessments or compliance checks, directly violates regulatory mandates for responsible research conduct and contract management. This can expose the organization to significant legal liabilities, reputational damage, and potential sanctions. A third incorrect approach that neglects to document process changes or their impact fails to meet regulatory requirements for auditability and transparency, hindering future process improvements and potentially leading to inconsistent application of procedures. Professional reasoning in such situations should involve a systematic evaluation of the current contract lifecycle process, identifying specific pain points and their root causes. This should be followed by a data-driven assessment of potential optimization strategies, considering their impact on efficiency, compliance, and risk. Collaboration with relevant stakeholders, including legal, compliance, and operational teams, is essential to ensure that proposed changes are practical and effectively address identified challenges, while remaining within the bounds of applicable regulations and ethical standards. Continuous monitoring and evaluation of implemented changes are also critical to ensure sustained effectiveness and identify further opportunities for improvement. Question 12. Consider a scenario where a research team is eager to commence a new study involving the collection of personal health information from participants. The research contract with the funding body requires adherence to all relevant data protection regulations. The team has drafted a participant consent form and is ready to begin recruitment, but the Institutional Review Board (IRB) has not yet provided its final approval for the data handling protocols. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory compliance best practices for research contracts? Option A. Proceed with participant recruitment and data collection immediately, assuming the IRB approval will be a formality and can be obtained retrospectively. Option B. Rely on the research team's understanding of general data privacy principles without seeking specific IRB approval or formal review of the consent form by the funding body's legal department. Option C. Halt all participant recruitment and data collection until the IRB has issued formal written approval of the data handling protocols and the participant consent form has been reviewed and approved by the funding body's legal department. Option D. Begin collecting anonymized data only, as this bypasses the need for specific IRB approval for personal health information. The correct answer is A. Proceed with participant recruitment and data collection immediately, assuming the IRB approval will be a formality and can be obtained retrospectively. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in research contract management, balancing the need for timely project initiation with the imperative of regulatory compliance. The professional challenge lies in navigating the complex web of regulations governing research contracts, particularly those related to data privacy and intellectual property, without unduly delaying critical research activities. A careful judgment is required to ensure that all necessary approvals and agreements are in place before any research involving sensitive data or proprietary information commences, thereby mitigating legal, financial, and reputational risks. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough review and adherence to all applicable regulatory frameworks, specifically those governing data protection and intellectual property within the specified jurisdiction. This proactive stance ensures that the research is conducted ethically and legally, safeguarding participant privacy and respecting intellectual property rights. It demonstrates a commitment to due diligence and risk management, which are fundamental to responsible research contracting. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with data collection before obtaining necessary ethical and regulatory approvals fails to comply with data protection laws and ethical guidelines. This could lead to significant penalties, invalidation of research findings, and damage to the reputation of the institution and the researchers involved. Another incorrect approach, such as assuming that standard institutional templates are sufficient without specific review for the nuances of the research project and its data handling requirements, overlooks potential regulatory gaps. This can result in noncompliance with specific provisions of data privacy legislation or intellectual property agreements, exposing the parties to legal challenges and breaches of contract. Finally, an approach that delays the project indefinitely due to minor, easily resolvable compliance issues demonstrates a lack of proactive problem solving and an inability to effectively manage regulatory processes. While compliance is paramount, an overly cautious or inefficient approach can hinder scientific progress and the dissemination of valuable research. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic assessment of all regulatory requirements relevant to the specific research project. This includes identifying applicable data protection laws, intellectual property regulations, and any institutional or funder-specific compliance mandates. A risk-based approach should be employed, prioritizing critical compliance steps that, if overlooked, could lead to severe consequences. Collaboration with legal counsel, ethics committees, and relevant compliance officers is essential to ensure all aspects are adequately addressed. Furthermore, developing clear internal processes for contract review and approval, with defined timelines and responsibilities, can streamline compliance efforts and prevent unnecessary delays. Question 13. The investigation demonstrates that a critical research partner has requested access to preliminary, proprietary data to assess the feasibility of a joint project. The CRCP professional is aware that this data contains sensitive competitive information. The partner has indicated a willingness to sign a confidentiality agreement, but has not yet received or reviewed a draft. The CRCP professional needs to decide how to proceed to facilitate the potential collaboration while upholding their professional responsibilities. Option A. Inform the research partner that the data cannot be shared until a fully executed confidentiality and non-disclosure agreement, CNDA, is in place, and provide a draft CNDA for their review. Option B. Share a redacted version of the preliminary data that omits the most sensitive competitive details, pending the execution of a CNDA. Option C. Provide the preliminary data to the research partner immediately, with the understanding that a formal confidentiality agreement will be executed shortly thereafter. Option D. Proceed with sharing the data, assuming that the research partner's professional reputation implies an inherent commitment to confidentiality. The correct answer is C. Provide the preliminary data to the research partner immediately, with the understanding that a formal confidentiality agreement will be executed shortly thereafter. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for information to advance a research project with the long-term legal and ethical obligations of confidentiality. The CRCP professional must navigate the potential for unauthorized disclosure of proprietary information, which could have significant financial and reputational consequences for the disclosing party. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any information shared is done so under appropriate legal safeguards. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the establishment of a robust legal framework before any sensitive information is exchanged. A well-drafted confidentiality and non-disclosure agreement, CNDA, clearly defines the scope of confidential information, the obligations of the receiving party, the duration of the confidentiality period, and the remedies for breach. This proactive measure aligns with the ethical duty to protect proprietary information and the regulatory expectation that research contracts are executed with due diligence and legal compliance. It ensures that both parties understand their responsibilities and that the research can proceed with a clear understanding of the boundaries of information sharing. An incorrect approach that involves sharing information without a signed CNDA represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It breaches the fundamental principle of confidentiality, potentially exposing the disclosing party to the risk of intellectual property theft or competitive disadvantage. This action could violate contractual obligations, industry best practices, and potentially specific regulations governing data protection and intellectual property, depending on the nature of the research and the information involved. Another incorrect approach, such as relying on a verbal agreement, is professionally unacceptable because it lacks enforceability and clarity. Verbal agreements are notoriously difficult to prove, leaving both parties vulnerable to disputes and misunderstandings regarding the scope of confidentiality and the consequences of disclosure. This approach fails to meet the standard of due diligence expected in research contracting and exposes the parties to undue risk. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic risk assessment. First, identify the type and sensitivity of information to be shared. Second, determine the legal and ethical obligations related to that information. Third, consult with legal counsel to draft or review a CNDA that adequately protects the disclosing party's interests. Fourth, ensure that all parties understand and agree to the terms of the CNDA before any exchange of confidential information occurs. Finally, maintain clear records of all agreements and communications. Question 14. Upon reviewing a draft research contract for a novel therapeutic agent, a certified research contracts professional, CRCP, notices a clause that, while not explicitly mandating favorable results, strongly implies that the sponsor expects the research to demonstrate efficacy. The CRCP is aware that preliminary internal data, not yet formally analyzed or published, suggests a less conclusive outcome than the sponsor might anticipate. The CRCP must advise the research team and the sponsor on how to proceed with this contractual clause in light of the potential for non-favorable findings. Option A. Advise the research team to focus their analysis on the most positive aspects of the preliminary data and to frame the reporting in a way that emphasizes potential benefits, while downplaying any inconclusive or negative findings to align with the sponsor's implied expectations. Option B. Suggests that the CRCP negotiate with the sponsor to remove any mention of expected outcomes from the contract, arguing that such clauses are inherently problematic and can lead to pressure on researchers, without offering an alternative commitment to objective reporting. Option C. Propose an amendment to the clause that explicitly states the research will be conducted and reported with scientific integrity and objectivity, regardless of the outcome, and that all findings will be disclosed accurately and in a timely manner, in accordance with ethical research standards. Option D. Recommend that the research team delay the formal reporting of findings until further experiments can be conducted to definitively prove efficacy, even if this extends beyond the original contractual timelines, to avoid disappointing the sponsor with preliminary, potentially unfavorable, results. The correct answer is C. Propose an amendment to the clause that explicitly states the research will be conducted and reported with scientific integrity and objectivity, regardless of the outcome, and that all findings will be disclosed accurately and in a timely manner, in accordance with ethical research standards. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a sponsor's desire for favorable research outcomes and the researcher's ethical obligation to report findings accurately and objectively, regardless of their implications for the sponsor. The CRCP professional must navigate this delicate balance, ensuring that contractual obligations do not compromise scientific integrity or regulatory compliance. Careful judgment is required to uphold ethical standards while fulfilling contractual duties. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes transparency and adherence to the established ethical guidelines for research conduct. By proactively addressing the sponsor's concerns through open communication, and by clearly articulating the commitment to unbiased reporting as stipulated by ethical principles, and potentially by the research institution's policies, the CRCP professional safeguards the integrity of the research and maintains trust. This aligns with the core tenets of ethical research, which demand that findings be reported truthfully, even if they are not what the sponsor hoped for. This approach also preempts potential disputes by setting clear expectations regarding data interpretation and reporting. An incorrect approach that involves withholding or selectively presenting data would represent a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This action directly violates the principle of scientific integrity and could be construed as research misconduct. It undermines the credibility of the research, potentially misleads stakeholders, and could have serious consequences if the research is used for decision-making. Furthermore, such an approach could breach contractual clauses related to accurate reporting and may violate institutional policies or professional codes of conduct governing research ethics. Another incorrect approach, such as agreeing to alter the interpretation of results to please the sponsor, is equally problematic. This constitutes a compromise of scientific objectivity and can lead to the dissemination of inaccurate or misleading information. It creates a conflict of interest and erodes the trust placed in the research process. This action could also have legal ramifications if the misrepresented findings lead to harm or financial loss. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the research contract's terms, relevant ethical guidelines, such as those pertaining to research integrity and conflicts of interest, and institutional policy. The CRCP professional should first identify the potential ethical conflict. Then, they should engage in open and honest communication with the sponsor, clearly explaining the ethical obligations and contractual commitments regarding unbiased reporting. If the sponsor persists in seeking biased reporting, the professional should consult with their institution's ethics committee or legal counsel to determine the appropriate course of action, which may include seeking to amend the contract or, in extreme cases, withdrawing from the project if ethical compromises cannot be avoided. The paramount consideration must always be the integrity of the research and adherence to ethical principles. Question 15. Operational review demonstrates that a research contract funded by a U.S. federal agency is experiencing significant performance issues by the contractor, potentially constituting a material breach. The contract includes standard termination for default clauses. What is the most compliant and professionally sound approach to address this situation? Option A. Immediately issue a notice of termination for default, citing the performance issues as the sole reason to prevent further project delays and potential cost overruns. Option B. Inform the contractor verbally about the performance issues and request immediate improvement without issuing a formal written notice, assuming this informal approach will be sufficient to resolve the problem. Option C. Initiate a formal review of the contract's termination for default provisions. Assess the contractor's performance against contractual requirements, and, if grounds are met, issue a cure notice as required by the contract and applicable regulations before considering termination. Option D. Proceed with terminating the contract for convenience, as this offers more flexibility and avoids the complexities of proving a default, thereby expediting the resolution. The correct answer is A. Immediately issue a notice of termination for default, citing the performance issues as the sole reason, to prevent further project delays and potential cost overruns. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of contract law and regulatory compliance within the specific framework of the Certified Research Contracts Professional (CRCP) exam's jurisdiction. The CRCP designation implies a focus on U.S. federal regulations governing research contracts, particularly those involving government funding. The core challenge lies in correctly interpreting and applying the termination clauses and procedures as mandated by these regulations, ensuring that any action taken is both contractually sound and legally compliant, thereby avoiding potential disputes, financial penalties, and reputational damage. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it adheres strictly to the established regulatory framework for terminating research contracts. This involves a systematic process of reviewing the contract's termination clauses, identifying the specific grounds for termination, ensuring all procedural requirements, such as notice periods and cure opportunities, are met, and documenting every step meticulously. This aligns with the principles of good contract administration and the explicit requirements of regulations like the Federal Acquisition Regulation, FAR, or relevant agency-specific supplements, which govern government-funded research. Adherence to these procedures protects the contracting parties, ensures fair dealing, and maintains the integrity of the research funding process. An incorrect approach that fails to follow the contractually stipulated notice periods for termination for default would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Such a failure could lead to a wrongful termination claim by the contractor, potentially resulting in litigation, damages, and sanctions. Ethically, it demonstrates a disregard for contractual obligations and fair process. Another incorrect approach, such as terminating a contract for convenience without proper justification or without following the prescribed procedures for such terminations, which often involve compensation for work performed and termination costs, would also be a regulatory failure. This could lead to disputes over compensation and a breach of the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing. Furthermore, failing to consult with legal counsel when significant termination issues arise is a critical professional failing, as it bypasses essential expertise needed to navigate complex legal and regulatory landscapes, increasing the risk of non-compliance. Professionals should approach termination situations by first thoroughly reviewing the contract's termination clauses and relevant governing regulations. They should then identify the specific grounds for termination and assess whether those grounds have been met. A critical step is to determine the required procedural steps, including notice periods, opportunities to cure, and any required approvals. Documenting all communications and actions is paramount. If there is any ambiguity or significant legal implication, consulting with legal counsel specializing in government contracts is an essential part of the decision-making process. This systematic and legally informed approach ensures compliance, minimizes risk, and upholds professional standards. Question 16. Examination of the data shows that a research institution is preparing to negotiate a complex collaborative research agreement with a pharmaceutical company. Multiple internal departments, including legal, finance, research and development, and technology transfer, have expressed varying priorities and concerns regarding intellectual property ownership, data sharing protocols, and publication rights. The contract professional must develop a negotiation strategy that effectively addresses these diverse internal perspectives, while also considering the pharmaceutical company's likely objectives. Which of the following approaches best prepares the contract professional for this negotiation? Option A. Focus exclusively on the legal requirements and contractual clauses that protect the institution from liability, as this is the primary responsibility of the contract professional and will ensure the most secure agreement. Option B. Prioritize the objectives of the department that controls the most significant portion of the research funding, assuming their financial interests are paramount and will naturally lead to the most advantageous outcome for the institution. Option C. Conduct a thorough stakeholder analysis to identify all internal parties with an interest in the agreement, meticulously document their stated objectives and underlying concerns, and then synthesize this information to define a prioritized set of negotiation objectives for the institution that balances competing interests and aligns with strategic goals. Option D. Immediately begin drafting a counterproposal based on the initial understanding of the pharmaceutical company's likely interests, without a formal internal consensus-building process, to demonstrate proactivity and secure a strong starting position. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough stakeholder analysis to identify all internal parties with an interest in the agreement. Meticulously document their stated objectives and underlying concerns, and then synthesize this information to define a prioritized set of negotiation objectives for the institution that balances competing interests and aligns with strategic goals. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a contract professional to navigate complex stakeholder interests and competing objectives during the critical preparation phase for a research contract negotiation. The challenge lies in synthesizing diverse perspectives into a coherent negotiation strategy that aligns with the organization's overarching goals while adhering to regulatory requirements. Careful judgment is required to prioritize objectives and identify potential areas of conflict or compromise early on. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it emphasizes a structured, data-driven, and collaborative method for understanding stakeholder needs and defining clear, achievable objectives. This aligns with the principles of good governance and ethical conduct expected of a certified research contracts professional, CRCP. By systematically identifying all relevant stakeholders, understanding their motivations and concerns, and then translating these insights into measurable negotiation objectives, the professional ensures that the negotiation strategy is robust, defensible, and likely to achieve a favorable outcome for the organization. This proactive approach minimizes the risk of misaligned expectations, scope creep, or post-contractual disputes, all of which can have significant financial and reputational implications. Adherence to the CRCP ethical guidelines, which likely mandate diligence, integrity, and a commitment to organizational best interests, is directly supported by this methodical preparation. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the immediate financial gains without considering the long-term implications or the broader stakeholder landscape would be professionally unacceptable. This could lead to a negotiation that secures short-term benefits but alienates key partners or creates unsustainable contractual obligations, potentially violating ethical duties of care and diligence. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes a single, dominant stakeholder's agenda over others, without proper justification or organizational mandate, would be a failure of impartiality and could lead to an unbalanced contract that is detrimental to the organization's overall research objectives and reputation. Furthermore, an approach that neglects to document the stakeholder analysis and objective setting process will be a failure of due diligence and transparency, making it difficult to justify the negotiation strategy if challenged and potentially contravening record-keeping requirements. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with comprehensive stakeholder mapping and analysis. This involves identifying all parties with an interest in the research contract, understanding their influence, and assessing their objectives and potential concerns. Following this, a clear articulation of the organization's primary and secondary objectives for the contract should be developed, ensuring they are smart, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound. This framework should then facilitate the identification of potential areas of synergy and conflict among stakeholder objectives and the organization's goals. Finally, the process should culminate in the development of a prioritized negotiation strategy that balances competing interests and maximizes the likelihood of achieving the desired contractual outcomes, all while remaining within the bounds of applicable regulations and ethical standards. Question 17. Performance analysis shows a recurring issue where sponsors express dissatisfaction with research outcomes, citing deviations from their initial expectations, even when the research team believes they have adhered to the agreed-upon scope and methodology outlined in the contract. In such a situation, what is the most professionally sound approach to resolving the sponsor's concerns and mitigating future conflicts? Option A. Initiate a collaborative discussion with the sponsor to thoroughly understand their specific concerns, review the contractual scope and deliverables together, and explore potential adjustments or clarifications that can be mutually agreed upon, while documenting all communications and resolutions. Option B. Proceed with modifying the research plan and deliverables to align with the sponsor's current demands without formal amendment, assuming this will appease them and avoid further conflict. Option C. Advise the sponsor that the only recourse is to engage legal counsel to interpret the contract and determine the extent of the institution's obligations. Option D. Immediately inform the sponsor that the research team has fulfilled all contractual obligations and that their dissatisfaction is unfounded, referencing specific clauses in the contract. The correct answer is A. Initiate a collaborative discussion with the sponsor to thoroughly understand their specific concerns, review the contractual scope and deliverables together, and explore potential adjustments or clarifications that can be mutually agreed upon, while documenting all communications and resolutions. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in research contract negotiations, where differing interpretations of project scope and deliverables can lead to disputes. The professional challenge lies in navigating these disagreements constructively, ensuring that the contractual obligations are met while maintaining a positive working relationship between the research institution and the sponsor. Careful judgment is required to identify the root cause of the conflict and to select an approach that aligns with ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. The correct approach emphasizes collaborative problem solving and a commitment to understanding both parties' perspectives. This aligns with best professional practice by fostering transparency and good faith in contractual dealings. Specifically, within the framework of research contracts, this approach upholds the principles of fair dealing and mutual respect, which are implicitly expected in professional conduct and can be supported by general principles of contract law that encourage parties to act reasonably and in good faith to resolve disputes. It seeks to find a mutually agreeable solution that addresses the underlying issues without resorting to adversarial tactics, thereby preserving the integrity of the research project and the relationship. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on asserting contractual rights without seeking to understand the sponsor's concerns represents a failure in professional judgment. This can lead to an escalation of the dispute, potentially resulting in costly litigation or the termination of the research project. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of commitment to partnership and can be seen as a breach of the spirit of collaboration often inherent in research endeavors. From a regulatory perspective, while not a direct violation of a specific statute in this context, such an approach can undermine the principles of due diligence and responsible contract management expected of professionals. Another incorrect approach that involves unilaterally altering project deliverables to meet the sponsor's perceived demands without formal amendment or mutual agreement is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This bypasses established contractual processes, potentially leading to non-compliance with the original agreement, misrepresentation of project progress, and a breakdown of trust. It can also expose the institution to legal liability for breach of contract and professional misconduct. A third incorrect approach that involves immediately seeking legal counsel to enforce the contract without attempting any form of direct negotiation or mediation can be premature and damaging to the relationship. While legal recourse is an option, it should typically be a last resort after good faith efforts to resolve the issue have been exhausted. This approach can signal an adversarial stance, potentially alienating the sponsor and hindering the possibility of a mutually beneficial resolution. It may also be seen as a failure to exercise due diligence in exploring less confrontational conflict resolution methods. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Actively listening to and understanding the other party's concerns. 2. Clearly articulating one's own perspective and the basis for it, referencing the contract. 3. Exploring potential solutions collaboratively, considering the impact on the project and the relationship. 4. Documenting all discussions and agreements. And 5. Escalating to formal dispute resolution mechanisms only when all other avenues have been exhausted. Question 18. Compliance review shows that during negotiations for a significant sponsored research agreement, the sponsor insisted on an indemnification clause that would hold the institution harmless for any and all claims, damages, losses, or expenses arising out of or in connection with the research, regardless of fault. The institution's standard contract template and risk management policies limit indemnification to damages directly caused by the institution's gross negligence or willful misconduct, which negotiation strategy best balances the sponsor's desire for comprehensive protection with the institution's need to manage its financial and legal exposure within regulatory guidelines. Option A. Immediately accept the sponsor's broad indemnification clause to expedite the agreement and secure the research funding, assuming that the institution's general liability insurance will cover any potential claims. Option B. Reject the sponsor's indemnification clause outright and insist on the institution's standard clause without further discussion, citing it as non-negotiable due to institutional policy. Option C. Propose a revised indemnification clause that clearly defines the scope of liability, limiting it to damages directly arising from the sponsor's specific actions or omissions, or from risks mutually acknowledged and accepted as inherent to the research, while also exploring the feasibility of extending coverage through institutional insurance for specific, agreed-upon scenarios. Option D. Agree to the broad indemnification clause, but attempt to offset the perceived risk by demanding a significantly higher indirect cost rate on the research project. The correct answer is C. Propose a revised indemnification clause that clearly defines the scope of liability, limiting it to damages directly arising from the sponsor's specific actions or omissions, or from risks mutually acknowledged and accepted as inherent to the research, while also exploring the feasibility of extending coverage through institutional insurance for specific, agreed-upon scenarios. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in research contract negotiation, where a sponsor, seeking to expedite the research, proposes a broad indemnification clause that extends beyond the typical scope of liability for negligence. The professional contract manager must balance the sponsor's desire for speed and risk mitigation with the institution's fiduciary duty to protect its assets and researchers from undue financial exposure. The challenge lies in identifying the precise point where the sponsor's request becomes unreasonable and potentially exposes the institution to uninsurable or unmanageable risks, all while maintaining a collaborative negotiation environment. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a principled negotiation strategy focused on understanding the sponsor's underlying interests and proposing alternative risk-sharing mechanisms that are aligned with industry standards and institutional policy. This includes clearly defining the scope of indemnification to cover direct damages arising from the sponsor's specific actions or omissions, or from the inherent risks of the research as mutually understood and accepted. It also involves leveraging institutional insurance and risk management expertise to assess the feasibility and cost of covering certain liabilities, and being prepared to articulate the rationale for any limitations or exclusions based on regulatory requirements and best practices for research contracting. This approach upholds the institution's ethical obligation to protect its resources and personnel while fostering a productive sponsor relationship. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately reject the broad indemnification request without exploring the sponsor's concerns or proposing alternatives. This can be perceived as uncooperative and may lead to stalled negotiations or the loss of a valuable research collaboration. Ethically, it fails to engage in good faith negotiation. Another incorrect approach is to accept the broad indemnification clause without adequate due diligence or consultation with institutional risk management and legal counsel. This exposes the institution to potentially catastrophic financial liabilities that may not be covered by insurance and could violate institutional policies designed to safeguard its assets. This represents a failure in professional due diligence and fiduciary responsibility. A third incorrect approach is to concede to the broad indemnification in exchange for minor concessions elsewhere, without fully understanding the long-term implications of the indemnification. This demonstrates a lack of strategic thinking and a failure to prioritize the institution's core risk management objectives. It can lead to unforeseen financial burdens and reputational damage. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such negotiations by first understanding the sponsor's objectives and risk tolerance. They should then assess the request against institutional policies, insurance coverage, and industry best practices. The decision-making process should involve identifying acceptable risk levels, exploring alternative risk allocation methods, e.g., limitations of liability, mutual indemnification for specific breaches, and clearly communicating the rationale for proposed terms to the sponsor. Collaboration with internal legal and risk management teams is crucial to ensure compliance and sound financial stewardship. Question 19. Analysis of a research team's proposed budget for a federally funded project reveals a line item for general office supplies that is intended to cover paper, pens, and general administrative consumables used by multiple research groups within the department, not solely the proposed project. The research administrator is considering classifying this entire amount as a direct cost to the project to maximize the direct cost base, which could potentially increase the total award amount if the indirect cost rate is applied to a larger direct cost pool. What is the most appropriate classification and justification for this line item according to standard U.S. federal research grant regulations? Option A. This should be classified as a direct cost, but only if a specific allocation methodology is documented to demonstrate how much of the supplies are used by the proposed project. Option B. This should be classified as a direct cost, and the administrator's rationale for maximizing the direct cost base is a valid strategy to secure more funding. Option C. This should be classified as an indirect cost, as general office supplies benefit multiple projects and the institution, and are typically covered by the institution's negotiated indirect cost rate. Option D. This should be classified as a direct cost, as the supplies are essential for the day-to-day operations of the research team. The correct answer is C. This should be classified as an indirect cost, as general office supplies benefit multiple projects and the institution, and are typically covered by the institution's negotiated indirect cost rate. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in research contract management, accurately categorizing costs within a research budget, specifically distinguishing between direct and indirect costs. The challenge lies in the potential for ambiguity, differing institutional policies, and the pressure to present a budget that is both compliant and competitive. Misclassification can lead to audits, disallowed costs, and strained relationships with funding agencies. Careful judgment is required to ensure adherence to the specific guidelines of the funding body and the institution, as well as to maintain the integrity of the research project's financial planning. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a meticulous review of the proposed expenditures against the definitions of direct and indirect costs as stipulated by the relevant regulatory framework for the Certified Research Contracts Professional (CRCP) exam. This framework, which for the purpose of this exam is assumed to be based on U.S. federal regulations, e.g., Uniform Guidance 2 CFR Part 200, defines direct costs as those that can be identified specifically with a particular sponsored project, instructional activity, or any other institutional activity. Indirect costs, also known as F&O overhead costs, are those incurred for common or joint objectives and cannot be readily identified with a particular final cost objective. Best professional practice dictates that each budget line item be rigorously assessed against these definitions. For instance, personnel salaries directly working on the research project are direct costs, while administrative support for the entire department housing the research or utilities for the building are typically indirect costs, subject to an established indirect cost rate agreement. This ensures transparency, accountability, and compliance with funding agency policies, preventing misallocation of funds and potential penalties. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to broadly categorize all project-specific expenses as direct costs without considering whether they are truly allocable to the specific project or are shared resources. This fails to acknowledge the existence and proper application of indirect costs, which are legitimate expenses that support research infrastructure. Regulatory failure here lies in not adhering to the principles of cost allocation and the established mechanisms for recovering institutional overhead, as outlined in federal cost principles. Another incorrect approach is to arbitrarily assign a portion of administrative salaries to the project as direct costs without a clear, documented methodology for allocation. While some administrative effort directly supporting the project might be allowable as a direct cost, it must be justifiable and consistently applied. Without this, it risks being classified as an unallowable direct cost or an improperly charged indirect cost, violating principles of cost reasonableness and allowability. A third incorrect approach is to exclude certain essential support services that are typically covered by indirect costs from the budget altogether, assuming they will be absorbed by the institution without proper accounting. This can lead to underbudgeting for the true cost of conducting the research, and may violate the principle that all costs incurred for a sponsored project should be accounted for, either directly or indirectly. It also fails to recognize the negotiated indirect cost rate as a mechanism for recovering institutional support. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach to budget development. This involves first understanding the specific requirements and definitions provided by the funding agency and the institution's policies. Then, Each anticipated expenditure should be evaluated against these definitions. If an expense can be directly traced and is solely for the benefit of the sponsored project, it is a direct cost. If it benefits multiple projects or the institution as a whole, it is likely an indirect cost and should be budgeted according to the established indirect cost rate. When in doubt, consult institutional sponsored programs offices or finance departments for clarification. This methodical process ensures accuracy, compliance, and ethical financial management of research funds. Question 20. The evaluation methodology shows that when assessing the risks associated with an international research contract involving a partner institution in a country with significantly different cultural norms regarding directness in communication and hierarchical decision-making, which of the following approaches is most critical for ensuring compliance with U.S. federal research contract regulations and fostering a successful collaboration? Option A. Delegating the responsibility for understanding cultural differences entirely to the international partner, assuming they will adapt to U.S. contractual norms. Option B. Relying exclusively on standardized U.S. federal contract templates and assuming all parties will interpret clauses uniformly, regardless of their cultural background. Option C. Proactively identifying potential cultural communication and negotiation style differences and developing strategies to bridge these gaps to ensure mutual understanding and agreement on all contractual terms. Option D. Prioritizing the speed of contract finalization by minimizing discussions on non-essential cultural nuances, focusing solely on legalistic language. The correct answer is C. Proactively identifying potential cultural communication and negotiation style differences and developing strategies to bridge these gaps to ensure mutual understanding and agreement on all contractual terms. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the complexities of cross-cultural communication and negotiation within the strict confines of research contract regulations. The CRCP certification implies a focus on U.S. federal regulations governing research contracts, particularly those involving federal funding and intellectual property. Misinterpreting or ignoring cultural nuances can lead to misunderstandings, damaged relationships, and ultimately, non-compliance with contractual obligations and regulatory requirements, potentially jeopardizing funding and research integrity. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a proactive and informed risk assessment that explicitly incorporates cultural considerations. This aligns with the ethical imperative to conduct research responsibly and compliantly, ensuring that all parties understand and agree to the terms of the contract. By identifying potential cultural barriers to communication, negotiation styles, and decision-making processes, a CRCP professional can develop strategies to mitigate these risks, ensuring clarity, mutual respect, and adherence to U.S. federal research contract principles. This proactive stance prevents misunderstandings that could lead to disputes or breaches of contract, which are critical concerns under federal acquisition regulations. An incorrect approach that overlooks cultural differences fails to adequately assess and manage risks. This can lead to misinterpretations of contractual intent, unmet expectations, and potential violations of clauses related to intellectual property, data sharing, or reporting requirements, all of which are heavily regulated in U.S. federal research contracts. For instance, a direct communication style that is acceptable in one culture might be perceived as aggressive or disrespectful in another, leading to a breakdown in negotiations and a contract that is not truly understood or agreed upon by all parties. This failure to account for cultural context can result in contractual disputes, audit findings, and potential debarment from future federal funding, representing significant regulatory and ethical failures. Another incorrect approach that relies solely on standardized contract templates without adaptation for cultural context ignores the practical realities of international collaboration. While templates provide a baseline, they do not inherently address the diverse ways in which parties from different cultural backgrounds may interpret obligations, deadlines, or dispute resolution mechanisms. This can lead to implicit assumptions that are not shared, creating a foundation for future conflict and noncompliance with the spirit, if not the letter, of the contract. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic risk assessment framework. This framework should begin with identifying all parties involved and their respective cultural backgrounds. Subsequently, potential cultural differences that could impact contract negotiation, interpretation, and execution should be identified. This involves researching common communication styles, negotiation tactics, decision-making hierarchies, and attitudes towards time and authority prevalent in the collaborating cultures. Based on this assessment, specific mitigation strategies should be developed, such as employing culturally sensitive communication protocols, seeking clarification on ambiguous terms, and potentially engaging cultural liaisons. Continuous monitoring and open communication throughout the contract lifecycle are also crucial to address any emerging cultural misunderstandings.